If we're okay to start. Fantastic. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion on assessing the impact of US-China rivalry on Ukraine and Taiwan, the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine that began on February 24th, 2022, has not only had a profound impact on the security and stability of Europe, but has also sparked discussions, often quite heated, about the potential implications for other regions, and particularly Taiwan, in the context of the growing rivalry between the United States and China. I am Kaiser Guo. I am the host of the Sinica podcast, and today we aim to explore how the strategic classes in the United States, China, Taiwan, and other relevant geographies process the events in Ukraine, and whether the commonly drawn parallels between Ukraine and Taiwan shed more light or they generate more heat when it comes to the complex dynamics surrounding the Taiwan Strait. We want to examine how the course of the war in Ukraine, shifting conditions on the battlefield, the impact, of course, of economic sanctions, the vicissitudes of securing munitions and other vital supplies from allies, has been seen from Washington, from Beijing, from Kiev, and of course from Taipei when they think about the implications for a possible Taiwan scenario. To help us navigate these critical issues, we have assembled a very distinguished panel of experts from diverse backgrounds. First, I'd like to introduce Dmytro Burtsev, a junior fellow at the Krymskyi Institute of Oriental Studies, National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Dmytro brings valuable insights into Ukraine's perspective on the conflict and its implications for global security. He joins us from Taipei. Very good to meet you, Dmytro.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning for everyone. Nice to see you.
Next, we are joined by Da Wei, who is director of the Center for International Security and Strategy and professor at the School of Social Sciences at Tsinghua University. Da Wei's expertise in Chinese foreign policy and strategic thinking will give us a nuanced understanding of China's approach to the events in Ukraine and their relevance, if there is any, to the Taiwan issue. We also, very nice to see you again, Professor Da.
Yeah, hi, Kaiser. It's good to see you. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening here in Beijing.
We also have Emilian Kavalski, who's professor at the Center for International Studies and Development at Jagiellonian. Okay, I'm going to do that again. Development at Jagiellonian University in Krakow. He's currently in Finland, he tells us. Emilian's knowledge of Central and Eastern European politics and security will help us to understand the regional implications of the Russo-Ukrainian war when it comes to the Taiwan issue and the broader US-China relationship. And finally, we are very nice to see you, Emilian, and I'm sorry about pronouncing the name of your university with such difficulty.
All right. You're not the first and will be the last one to mispronounce it. It's a privilege to be in this nice company here.
Well, you're very welcome to be here. Finally, we are pleased to have Yi, who is research fellow at the Institute of International Relations at National Chengchi University in Taiwan. Yi's insights into Taiwan's strategic calculus and its own self-perception in the face of the evolving geopolitical landscape is certain to be invaluable to our discussion. So a very warm welcome to you, Professor Yuan.
Thank you. A point of clarification, I'm the adjunct research fellow at this moment.
Okay, adjunct research fellow. I will make that correction. Throughout our discussion, we are going to explore the drivers of growing tension over Taiwan, the validity and the utility of comparisons between Ukraine and Taiwan, and the impact of the Russo-Ukrainian war on Taiwan's strategic thinking and global image. Our panelists are going to share very generously their expertise and engage in what I hope is going to be a very thought-provoking and informative conversation. Before we jump into that conversation, I want to give special thanks to Vida Holod, who I'm so delighted to have living here in my own community of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Vida, who is chair of the Ukrainian Association of Sinologists, organized this event and invited the speakers, and it really could not have happened without her. So thank you so much, Vida. Without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to ask each of you individual questions, but really feel free, if you have something you'd like to add succinctly, please raise your hand or message me and I will make sure to follow up. So I think it's appropriate that I should direct my first question to Yi, who, as we've just heard, is adjunct fellow at National Chengchi University in Taiwan. In the initial days and weeks after February 24th, there was a tendency, at least in Western media, if I'm not mistaken, Professor Yuan, and among quite a number of Western pundits, to immediately draw parallels, rightly or wrongly, between Ukraine and Taiwan. Many saw similarities in the nature of the debatable, very debatable historical claims by Russia and by China, respectively. Some used NATO's failed deterrence of Russia in Ukraine to argue against the long-standing unofficial policy of strategic ambiguity over Taiwan. Here in the US, that argument certainly happened. Others debated whether sanctions could at all be effective as a deterrent. And there were some who were, less interested in parallels or comparisons, but who claimed that Xi Jinping would likely, seize this moment of international distraction, of inattention, to make a move on Taiwan. So I'm curious, Dr. Yuan, what was the initial conversation like within Taiwan's strategic class in the days following the full-scale invasion? And how did that conversation, where Ukraine and Taiwan were concerned, evolve in the weeks and months and now years since the invasion began?
All right. Good morning, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me to address on the issue. I think, to be honest, as a Taiwanese scholar, we were shocked by this military invasion without knowing exactly the background. That is why what amazes us is by listening, instead of reading the Western reports, we actually try to find out, explore more about the very genesis, the very, very impulse that compel Vladimir Putin's military actions. So as a scholar of Taiwan, I discover or rediscover the very speech made by Putin at the dawn of the invasion. Then I discovered that he adopt a lot of historical anecdotes. I noticed by watching the map he present, there's a territory in the eastern part of Ukraine, Donbass and Luhansk. That part of the territory, with the Vladimir the 1922 policy adopted by the former USSR Soviet leader, right? And also there was another western part of the territory that was attached to the 1939-1945 by Stalin, and also the infamous 1953 Khrushchev concession of the Crimea or territory. All in all, I think the three pieces of territory addressed by Putin used as the legitimate cause, all right, to offer some historical reinterpretation of history, which amazes us, all right. So for whatever reason, I think that attract our attention from the very, very beginning. That is what caused that the Putin adopts such a drastic, all right. We try to figure out what constitutes the historical logic or whatever political logic that gave his to make his such a decision. So that's the first way of our interest. We were so intrigued by this. Other than later we joined the Western commentaries about the analogy or the similarity or the parallel that one could imagine to make a comparison of the two cases. And yet, I like to reiterate the very first way of curiosity derived from the Putin's interpretation of history So this brings us to this, the very, I don't know, line of logic that the rest of us is engaged, that is bringing Taiwan into the fore. I was in Washington, D.C. 3 weeks ago. As I enter into the hall of the Hudson Institute, I recognize they displays a 4 national flag, the U.S., Ukraine, Israel, and Republic of China, or a 4 national flag were on display at the very entrance, right? So I think that's set for the common denominator for an American position now, that is putting the 3 so-called frontier states altogether, all right, as a background. So to answer your question at the very outset, I was simply offer what I have learned about the page 1 and page 2 as a background. I will deepen the discussion as we speak.
Well, that is the Hudson Institute, of course, and that doesn't maybe necessarily represent, as he suggested, the common denominator of American thinking. It's very much on the American right? So given the fact that there's a Democratic administration in office right now, maybe they aren't so representative, but yeah, certainly it represents a portion of American thinking. Let me turn now to Dmytro Burtsev from the Institute of Oriental Studies at the National Academy of Sciences in Kyiv. I understand, of course, that you have, even in Taipei, you have more pressing things to think about. But even so, has the invasion changed the way the Ukrainian strategic class thinks about Taiwan's security and its relationship with China, that is, Kyiv's relationship with Beijing? At a broad level, does it believe that there are important parallels? Is it seeking to strengthen its ties with Taipei? What is the thinking among Ukrainians right now?
Okay, so well, let's go first to official position of Ukraine, official Ukrainian government, and all international treaties of Ukraine and China. So speaking very basically, Ukraine recognizes Taiwan as a part of China. That's written in a basic treaties between Ukraine and China, starting from 1992. And actually, Taiwan, even for now, I think it doesn't attract Ukrainian views, Ukrainian politicians, Ukrainian political elites, because, well, it's very far geopolitically, politically, mentally, and Kyiv has official position according to the place of Taiwan, within policy, within Chinese politics, I would say. Nevertheless, a lot of some of Ukrainian NGOs, they have their own opinion, I would say, but their position is not official, and actually it's very often controversial to position of the official Ukrainian government, of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. And Ukraine, well, if the conflict happens, well, for me, it's very difficult to say how official Kyiv, official Minister of Foreign Affairs gonna react on that.
I'm curious, though, broadly speaking, among the people like you who work in think tanks or in academia, is there a sort of acceptance that there are meaningful parallels between the two situations, or do they think that these are unrelated?
There are a bunch of thoughts and ideas, and some people say, okay, the situation is more or less same, and some people say, okay, it's a different situation because officially, the official position of the most countries which don't recognize the Taiwan as a state or Republic of China as a state. So there are a lot of different opinions about that, about history, about how it develops, and the parallels actually. Some people say, oh, it's like two democracies like Ukraine and Taiwan, and other groups says Taiwan is not a state, or at least not officially recognized state.
Whereas, of course, the entire international community, to include Russia, recognized after 1991 the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, right? I'd like to now turn to Professor Da Wei of Tsinghua University and ask him about how, if at all, the course of the war in Ukraine has impacted China's thinking about Taiwan. Perhaps this is really the crux question here. I think it's fair to say that those people who believed it was going to embolden Xi Jinping in the early days were mistaken, at least so far. We can't see inside Xi Jinping's head, of course, but you do have conversations daily with your colleagues at your own think tank and at others, and surely this topic comes up a lot. So how has strategic thinking been impacted by Putin's invasion of Ukraine? What lessons, if any, does Beijing take away from the course of the war so far? I mean, perhaps as you answer, you could talk about several dimensions of this. Maybe how does Beijing look at the Western alliance system and at the responses of the international community? Was it caught by surprise by the relative unity of the West so far? Touch wood. Does Beijing see that unity as durable? Does it see the sanctions regime as having been truly crippling, or is this something that Beijing could ultimately endure? Or that wouldn't work at all the same for China because it's so much more integrated than Russia was into the international economy?
Yes. First of all, I will say back to your earlier question, I think after the invasion, the initial response here in Beijing or in China is not very much Chinese response to that, no matter it's war or conflict, we don't relate it to Taiwan very much. And this is the first reaction because Taiwan is part of China, so it's completely different from Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine and Russia are two countries. They admit each other. They recognize each other as sovereign countries. So this is the one country invade the other country. So we also think in that way. So we don't think that we can compare that to Taiwan. Obviously, though the two sides across the strait now have tensions or different interpretation about the sovereignty issue, but the constitutions of the two sides, both sides, believe that both mainland China and Taiwan belong to the same country. So Taiwan and mainland is like Crimea and the Ukraine, rather than Russia and the Ukraine. So this is what we believe. I mean, in China, so we don't link that to Taiwan very much after the outbreak. But of course, then we heard from our American or Western colleagues and also read from media about this comparison about these two situations. And later, particularly on social media, of course, there are a lot of discussion about this war. And though the military mean is still the last mean of the mainland side, but of course, as particularly on the social media, a lot of people always discuss about the possible, potential military attack from the mainland to Taiwan. Then some of them will say, why Russian did such a poor job in this military action. So if we do that, we will do a much better job. Some other people say, it's very difficult. You see, Russia is a military power, very, very powerful military power. So to invade Ukraine and with such a difficulty, so if there's a military conflict between across the strait, it will be even more difficult than that between Russia and Ukraine. So generally speaking, at least among the policy circles or strategic communities that you refer to, my colleagues and my friends, I think most of us, the biggest takeaway of this war in Ukraine is, the biggest takeaway is a war is not easy. I think this is something, we learn from this war. So there is a strait, and Taiwan is, with the support of US and other Western countries, and when you see the not only the war on ground, but also the support from the Western countries, the sanctions that the Russian has been imposed, and the information warfares, any conflict could become very, very complicated. It's more than just artillery versus tank. I mean, this is now today the modern war become very, very complicated. So this conflict maybe make many people in our side to think any potential military action twice. I think this is my answer to your question. I think the takeaway from many people here in China.
So it's a combination not only of the simply the tactical level, the difficulty on the battlefield, but also the alliance system, and that has a parallel, of course, in the Western Pacific.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, many people discuss about many people here discuss about not only about Taiwan, maybe because from other reason that China may face similar sanctions that Russia is facing today. So can China survive that sanction, or can the US or the West afford that sanction? So there are a lot of kind of debate, as you said earlier. Not like Russia, China is very integrated with the international economy, so it's very close. So I think imposing China any that kind of sanction will hurt the rest of the world, particularly the Western country, very much. At the same time, of course, it will also hurt China, very deeply. So Russia is much less interconnected with the rest of the world. So it's totally different situation that China is facing.
Yeah. Let me turn now to Emilian Kavalski from Jagiellonian University. Poland has been defiant and very proactive in its aid to Ukraine along many dimensions in both humanitarian assistance and in provision of war material. It has also had a long history of diplomatic difficulty with Beijing, dating back at least as far back as 35 years ago. Next week, June 4th, 1989, Poland, of course, held its first full democratic election, while something else very different was happening in Beijing. So give us a sense of the view of this situation from Poland, and perhaps you can expand beyond just comparisons of Ukraine and Taiwan to talk about the view on the US-China relationship more broadly in light, especially of Putin's recent reception in Beijing, the Polish view of China's relationship with Moscow, and the potential participation of China in President Zelensky's peace summit, which he's convening in Switzerland.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks, Peter. That's a really interesting question, and very interesting, kind of like thought-provoking already insights from my other colleagues here on the panel. I think, speaking as East European here and someone who's based in Poland, I think Professor Yuan already mentioned that the war was a shock, but for many East Europeans, it was a shock, but something that was expected. Russia has started brinkmanship or claims towards its former territories of the Soviet Union in the near abroad, at least since 2008, since the war in Georgia. Russia has been engaged in hybrid warfare campaigns, or hot warfare campaigns as well, in places such as Moldova, the Caucasus, in Armenia, Azerbaijan conflict, etc. The conflict in Ukraine itself did not start in 2022. Like, this was in Eastern Europe. It's very interesting. The policymakers and scholars constantly say it's a full-scale invasion. The conflict in Ukraine, as Dmytro can say, started much earlier, and 2022 is simply the full-scale Russian territorial grab that Russia claimed. So for Eastern Europe and Poland in particular, it's been a very interesting moment because it kind of was I told you so moment. So in a way, it's kind of like I told you so both to Washington and to Brussels. That is the European Union, but also countries such as Germany and France have been trying to appease China and Russia as well by engaging in economic relations with those countries. And through economic trade relations, we can ensure that in particular Russia, Mr. Putin in particular, can play ball with us. It's going to be, there's some strategic interests and issues that we probably won't see eye to eye, but it's possible to talk to him because of the trade dependence. As we saw in 2022, it was the West that was dependent on Russia rather than the other way around. And in this context, a country such as Poland, which is quite large territorially, and has a significant military forces, but also strategically in Europe, especially after the recent election, has become increasingly more vocal voice within the European Union, but also within the NATO structures as well, has tried to claim both for itself, but East European countries, very well the case of tiny Lithuania, standing up to China in terms of proclaiming that it's going to defend democracy from Belarus to Taiwan. So I think here what's happening is what I think in Eastern Europe, and again, it's a gross generalization, but it's kind of like realignments, both vis-a-vis traditional Western allies and partners of East European countries within the institutions such as the European Union and NATO, but also towards East Asia, the growing realization that what I guess in America you would call the Indo-Pacific theater and the Ukrainian war connected, that there is an increasing connection between the eastern parts of the Eurasian landmass and the Indo-Pacific end of the Eurasian landmass. They're part of the same strategic theater. And increasingly, it seems that this whole narrative and discourse of these buffer zones and confrontation between new blocs with Russia, China on one side and the West, whatever that means in that setting as well, setting on the other side. Of course, it's an oversimplification, but I guess as any kind of like oversimplification, there's some truth to it potentially as well.
Sure. Emilian, I want to stay with you for just 1 second here because you've anticipated something that I intended to ask you later about. Of course, as you suggested, during the long tenure, especially of Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, her approach was a version of engagement, much as the United States with China, you could argue. The idea was that by enmeshing Russia in economic relations with Germany and with the EU more broadly, and of course, natural gas sales were obviously a very big part of that, although the dependencies, as you suggested, were very problematic, the direction of them. Russia would somehow have inducements to behave less disruptively in the world. This was a failure. It's very clear that it was. I mean, it was clearly a failure even before the 24th of February. But was it because there was insufficient engagement, or was any amount of engagement never going to dissuade Putin from doing what he did? And when it comes to the US and China, do you believe that economic interdependence can still factor into the Taiwan situation? That is, that Taiwan security could be more enhanced by, not decoupling as we currently seem to be doing?
Mm-hmm. Well, the answer here very much depends on which perspective you take. If you take the perspective,
I'm asking for yours.
I'm an academic scholar, so I can't give you the academic answer here. Is if you take the perspective of people such as John Mearsheimer, it's all about because of Western expansion of national security, like security alliances within Russia's strategic spheres of interest, is which promoted Putin. Of course, me as an Eastern European, as also IR scholar, have a lot to kind of contest that explanation. But also here, speaking again from perspective as a European and East European, here is that that there is a long history of Russian colonialism and that has been denied and rejected. So in a way that Russia has for a very long time claimed for its strategic interests territories which have been part of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union beforehand. And it's kind of very interesting here is that just the year before the invasion, Putin made this very interestingly, or published this very interesting academic article claiming that the inventedness or the invented nature of Ukrainian nationalism and Ukrainian nation, that it's never invented, was created by Lenin and others in the early years of the Soviet Union, etc. So it's kind of like, in that context, any form of engagement, any kind of interactions, economic, political, cultural, with Russia and the West, I would not have changed that mindset. If you have that mindset that Russia, or from Putin's point of view, or from the Kremlin's point of view, Ukraine is an invented nation that's always been Russian and needs to be reminded that it is Russian and it has to be part of Russia again. Putin has made it more explicitly, even recently, claiming Belarus is Russia, and which is, even though it's a much closer ally to Russia in that sense. So in this context, my argument vis-a-vis Russia-European relations, any amount of engagement that
will never trump nationalism, right?
Yeah. Nationalism only provided Putin with financial ammunition to build up his military capacities to develop its war machine. The situation with the Indo-Pacific is slightly different, simply because I think the interdependence first is slightly more complex and nuanced in that situation. And also there are a lot of mechanisms that can preempt or prevent war from taking place, or from the conflict becoming a hot war, simply because there are different arrangements. There's precedents in where great powers kind of reach agreements which prevent actual conflict. And both the US and China are unwilling to engage in a conflict behavior right now, regardless of the rhetoric on both sides, I think.
Yeah. Let's absolutely hope so. I want to come back to you, Dr. Yuan. In what ways has the international community's response to the war in Ukraine influenced Taiwan's strategic thinking and its preparations for a potential conflict with China? In other words, as they've watched the progress of the war, has Taiwan been taking cues? Has it seen what has been successful in Ukraine's resistance? Or has the sheer level of devastation that has been visited on Ukraine by Russia, the unwillingness of any allies to do more than supply weapons, that is, the unwillingness to commit forces, to engage, to enforce a no-fly zone, nothing beyond providing weapons, have these factors given pause to Taiwan's leaders? So how is this shaking out in Taipei?
All right, let me state my scholarly opinion first before that I reiterated the government position. All right, we clearly noticed that the P5, demonstrated its posture toward Ukraine on the issue on one very interesting statement or referendum, the Budapest memorandum. All right, the P
1994.
P3, yes, the Budapest memorandum on security assurance rendered by the US, the UK, and USSR for the first wave. They guarantee, all right, the security assurance, honor the sovereignty, all right, and followed by France and China. I think that the P2 also render their support to about the Ukraine sovereignty. So I think this is a very intriguing element for Taiwanese to watch. All right. Although we're no member to the existing multilateral organization, UN-related agency, and yet we've been deprived from our membership. But with the Ukraine, with the consent, unilateral multilateral consent of the P5 to uphold its sovereignty. On the one hand, and yet in reality, it could be something differently. So that's the important lesson we learned. Come back with the official position. I think the currently Taiwanese government propagated something that is whatever Russia has done to Ukraine will only embolden Chinese potential threat or invasion, quote unquote. This is exactly the remarks made by the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Joseph Wu. All right, he used exactly expression as a way to mobilize the national support. But for Taiwan, I think the issue relating to Ukraine versus USSR, resonated in one key element. That is, as I explained, I offer something at the very outset. It is about the statement Vladimir Putin made. Okay, he mentioned about Lenin's 1922's decision, and Khrushchev as a 53. All in all, which is to offer a clear example that the national collective identity between between Ukraine versus Russia are actually, it has a profound historical elements. I detach the similarity, all right, across Taiwan Strait. That the Chinese government also utilized that very historical elements to combine, to ties the relation.
Sure. Let's get to what I actually asked you though about how the strategic thinking and its preparations for a potential conflict have been affected by Taipei's observation of the progress of war.
Taipei has been informed time and again by people from Washington, D.C. They explained to Taiwan that U.S. treat Taiwan differently from Ukraine because there is a division, congressional division, between the Republican and the Democrats as how much, to what extent the United States should render its support. Whereas in the case of Taiwan, there is a consensus. There is a bipartisan consensus of the Capitol Hill to uphold Taiwan's safety. All right, there is a profound differences. The message being transmitted from Washington D.C. to Taipei to reiterate it that the unmistakably bipartisan support. All right, should China take any military action against Taiwan.
So you're confident that the United States will ride to Taiwan's rescue in the event?
I'm only repeating, the message being conveyed by the by Washington. All right, to differentiate it, it's a treatment about Taiwan versus Ukraine.
So you think that the Ukraine war has had no effect then on the thinking then in Taipei because in spite of Ukraine's successes so far in resisting, or in spite of the damage done to Ukraine, you've seen no real change in Taiwan's attitude?
All right,
it's just balanced out somehow? Or?
Okay, I don't want to be sound very realpolitik. I think the people of Taiwan share the frustration. All right, feel the pain that Ukrainian people suffer. All right.
Yeah.
So that's the very, very, very common elements. But whereas in our case, I think we also recognize Taiwan is no Ukraine because given the sheer size of territory, we are relatively small. We simply do not have something that Ukraine enjoy. All right. So we have a very, very sensible understanding about the profound differences of the two situation.
Let me stay with you for just 1 second and ask you a little bit about the closer relations between the relations that Taiwan is seeking between Taipei and Kyiv. The official narrative coming out of Taiwan seems to be that defending Taiwan is defending Ukraine, and defending Ukraine is defending Taiwan. Do you think that this closeness is ultimately in the interest of Ukraine, knowing that it is a red line for the PRC, or is it more likely to push the PRC more into Putin's camp than it already is? Does the equivalence between Ukraine and Taiwan dissuade China from taking a more active role in the war, or does it actually encourage it?
Actually, to be honest, we recognized the very, very genesis of a PRC, right? The very, very social origins of different type of polity, democracy versus authoritarian to begin with, right? That CCP was given birth by with the assistance of Moscow to begin with.
Well, to be fair, so was the KMT, right?
It is, yes. Then gradually, I think for the current situation, I think on average, Taiwan people recognized the type of political polity, make a different decision, whereas authoritarian take a different posture versus democratic regimes. So since Taiwan happens to be in a camp of democracy, it is natural for Taiwan to siding with the democracy.
Sure. Okay, I want to go back to Dmytro, Dmytro Burtsev. How's Ukraine's experience? We talked a little bit about Professor Yuan talked a little bit about the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. When Kiev looks at this, and it looks at the fact that Ukraine and the other major Soviet republics, Kazakhstan and whatnot, gave up all nuclear weapons in '94. How has this shaped its view of security assurances from major powers? And maybe what lessons, if you were to sit down with your counterparts in Taipei where you are, what would you tell them? What lessons should Taiwan be drawing from this experience, if any?
Well, I want to first go to Budapest Memorandum of 1994. And my personal opinion about that document, like is that, but as for me, well, it's a funny paper. It's a really funny paper. I'm sort of using this kind of language, but actually, if you look on it, if you look on the essence of document, if you look on the content of the articles, they give no security guarantees. It's not written there. We guarantee you the security of Ukraine. It's written that none of the guarantors will make an aggressive actions against Ukraine, and in case of attack by third party by nuclear weapon, they're gonna start consultation. It's not written. They're gonna restrain the third attacker or do something else. And if you compare this paper with even in US-Taiwan Act of 1979, we can see the drastic difference that US gonna protect Taiwan from jeopardizing. So for me, the wording is very different and the content is very different. And as we can see in practice, Budapest Memorandum didn't work because it had no legal power, it had no real power. That's the first thing. Another thing, that Ukraine was pushed to sign the Budapest Memorandum and give away all the nuclear weapons. And that pressure came from both sides, the Russian Federation and the United States. It's even for me, it's more difficult to say which of one was pushing worse on Ukraine. And speaking about Taiwan, actually, we come to another dilemma. Ukraine was recognized as a sovereign state by all parties of that agreement, but Taiwan is not officially recognized by 12 tiny states, not even small, tiny states.
Right.
So if Taiwan, in case of Taiwan, can get this sovereignty, well, it can be spoken about more serious guarantees, but well, that's like speaking about something very not existing, but if. And that's the thing. So, but anyway, even US-Taiwan Act of 1979, it has more guarantees for Taiwan than the Budapest Memorandum for Ukraine. That's a big difference.
Yeah, I think that's fair. The Taiwan Relations Act is probably a stronger document. Going back to you, Dawe, the logic of the old strategic triangle, nobody talks about this anymore, but it seems very clearly to have been broken. Putin, clearly he's still going to push forward unrelentingly in Ukraine, so there's zero chance for any sort of a rapprochement between Washington and Moscow. By the old logic, one would think that Washington would be doing its best to try to woo Beijing away from Moscow. But as far as I can see at present, there are no carrots being extended to Beijing, only sticks, only chastisements, warning against providing any aid. We saw this, with all the recent diplomacy. That seems to have been sort of the top line, that sternly warning Beijing against, there's only condemnation of Beijing's, pro-Moscow neutrality. It's the Beijing straddle. It leans very much toward Moscow right now. What inducements, though, would Beijing like to see? I mean, presumably, China would like to see the Americans take their knee off its neck when it comes to advanced technology inputs. And there are other things that the U.S. might be able to do, but they're not doing. What would Beijing like to see in this?
I think we don't have very high expectation to the United States. Of course, we want the U.S. to do something good, like lifting the restriction on high-tech products, like remove those Chinese companies from the entity list, and stopping, supporting the Taiwan Authority. I mean, those pro-independent politicians and all their activities. Of course, we want the U.S. to do that, but obviously, U.S. will do none of these things. I think you mentioned the triangle thing. If I agree with you, there's no strategic triangle now. Even if there is a triangle, because Russia is the relatively weaker party in this triangle, so theoretically the U.S. should rule Russia away from China rather
Right.
than try to drag China from away from Russia. And it is true that there are some experts or scholars here. They are minority here, but that group of experts do have some concern that maybe we don't know when, but maybe later. For example, if Trump win the election, maybe the U.S. will try to attract Russia, to American side. Of course, the rest of the experts community will say this is not doable, and we have this kind of debate here in China. But anyway, I think it's though I don't think it's possible, but theoretically, Russia is the party that maybe the West want to get closer rather than China. I think the U.S. still believe, even though Russia invade Ukraine and is in the war, we still believe that U.S. view China as the most serious, most important adversarial now and may in foreseeable future. So that's something structural. So we cannot change it.
Well, it's structural with him, but and certainly, while the Biden administration is not likely to take any moves that would please Putin or Moscow, there is the distinct possibility of what happens should Trump come back to power this fall. I'm curious, Yuan, what happens in Taipei if Trump comes back to power? I mean, he's already made clear he's not interested in continuing to arm Ukraine. How would Lai Ching-te respond to a Trump victory in November?
Unlike his predecessor, he didn't get any, conversation, all right, upon his inauguration ceremony. Therefore, I think the situation about whether the second term Donald Trump will be detrimental or not to Taiwan's interest, I think it's too early to tell, because Trump himself, fluctuated on a daily basis by his statement he made. Once he made a comparison that the insignificant role of Taiwan, toward the United States vis-a-vis that of China. Therefore, Taiwan recognized very, very highly volatile and political uncertainty ahead. I think they have to be prudent to watch and to work closely with their friends.
No, we know the same man, apparently, Donald Trump. I'm curious. I'm going to turn to Emilian. Are Central Eastern Europeans worried about the possibility of a Trump victory? How do you see that reshaping American priorities in Eastern Europe, as well as the Western Pacific, given Trump's unpredictability that Professor Yuan just accurately described. What are your contingencies there?
Well, contingencies is that I think contingency is an interesting word because Europe is much more fractured. Both Europe as a continent, different countries within it, but also East European countries are not a monolithic bloc. For instance, if we take leaders such as Orban in Hungary, the current leader of Slovakia, who recently had the assassination attempt, they'll be probably very happy if Trump comes back to power. Orban has been a keynote speaker to many Trump events and promotes many of his policies and narratives in Europe, and the whole notion of liberal illiberal democracy that he promotes is actually very closely affiliated with many of the statements that Trump himself makes, especially the right, the political right in the United States makes. On the other hand, countries such as Poland, the Baltic states, and I guess most of Europe are quite concerned. There's quite a lot of debate in Europe right now at the policy level about a possible withdrawal from the United States from NATO, how the alliance function without the United States. And this is not so much in terms of the interoperability and the strategic planning, because to all intents and purposes, European component of NATO is independent of the United States. The United States provides what's called the over-the-horizon forces. That's been agreed ever since the end of the Yugoslav wars, what's called the 1999 Berlin Plus Agreement, where there is, in the European theater, Europeans act alone without NATO. Symbolically, however, for the United States, especially for the United States alliance network, not just in Europe, but globally, that will have a very significant implication. If the United States pulls out from one of its oldest partnerships, security partnership alliances, and withdraws its commitments from that alliance, that would be a very important message it sends to any other partners to what extent the US can be trusted, as well to adversaries of the United States, such as Russia and China, and others who can actually benefit from that and use that to their advantage to promote certain narratives about the West and democracies in the United States in particular. So in this context, I think in Europe, there's quite a bit of consternation and concern overall about potential transatlantic partnership and its implications for European security, broadly defined, I think.
Thank you.
But I can jump in here for one of your previous questions about the lessons for Taiwan from the Ukraine crisis. I think it's kind of interesting here. What's, at least in the past 2 years, is becoming obvious is that if I were to be a Taiwanese policymaker or someone to advise Taiwan, is to develop close partnerships with neighbors in the region. Because if you are to look at, in terms of the day-to-day support for the military effort of the Ukrainian troops on the ground and the Ukrainian forces, actually it comes from East European countries. The United States provides high-end, very expensive weapon systems, but in terms of the mortars, the bullets, the fuel for the trucks, this comes from East European countries, largely from countries from the eastern flank of NATO. And that is something that, if I were to be to be a Taiwanese policymaker, that would be advised. If this one lesson learned is develop trusted partnerships in your neighborhoods. Right. If worst case scenario comes to pass.
Going back to that question about the potential of a Trump victory, I want to turn to Dmytro and ask, how do you see? I mean, obviously, Ukraine has had a fraught relationship with Donald Trump in the past. We all remember the first impeachment and the sort of tit for tat that the demanding that Ukraine investigate Hunter Biden and all that stuff, or we will hold up weapons provisions, and this could have been very, very crucial, in maybe even decisive in the early days of the war. What's going on now as you look over the horizon at November? Given his, again, famous unpredictability, does Ukraine have a plan B? I mean, can it live without the HIMARS? Can it live without those over the horizon weapons that are being provided right now from the US?
The question is very complicated, and I want to actually join my answer with Professor Yuan and Professor Kavalski, and I agree that Trump is a fluctuating personality, that one day he can say one thing, another day another thing, or he changed his mind even within one day. So Ukraine really doesn't know what to expect from him, and that's for some extent, it's really complicated for Ukrainian decision makers to make any forecasts if Trump comes up as a president. However, I think, well, his rhetoric can be like one from as a candidate, but leaving Ukraine without anything, it will be one more escape of America from conflict zone, leaving the allies without anything like it was in Afghanistan, for example, or well, the failure on the Middle East when American foreign policy was really injured badly, and it was a great reputation loss. So I don't think Trump is going on that, or at least Trump might go, but he also has an enormous team of advisors. He has a lot of people who know the situation better and who can give him better advice than just escaping from Ukraine. Because in this case, it will be the last phase for the whole, not for Trump, but for the whole US and American foreign policy. That's my opinion about the issue.
It's one that's shared by a lot of Americans as well. So you're not you're in good company. I want to turn back to Dawei here. Clearly, you think that if there's a lesson that China has taken away from the Taiwan, a lesson on Taiwan that China has taken away from the Ukraine war, it's don't do it. War is difficult, as you said. That you can't. It's not going to be a walk in the park. But let's talk about this specifically from the perspective of Xi Jinping himself. He must look at Putin and wonder, is Vladimir Putin's power and personal security improved since February 2022, or is it diminished? I can't imagine that Xi envies Putin in any way right now. He's been ostracized by the international community. He's already had one major sort of uprising, as we all recall, when the Wagner troops rose up. He's not in safety right now. So how do you think he looks at this situation, Xi Jinping?
Of course, the short answer is I don't know. I tend to view this question or answer your question from maybe not a political power, but the historic legacy. I mean, what kind of legacy? I think all the leaders in every country, I think they expect to have a legacy in history. So what kind of legacy can Putin have now? I think if without launching this war, probably Putin will have a better legacy for the history. Many people may view Putin as a leader, maybe lift Russia from the trauma of the post-Soviet period and make Russia much stronger and more prosperous. But now probably the biggest legacy will be this war, not a very successful war. So I think this is one of the reasons I think in Beijing here, many people think that maybe unless you have, you really are very certain about, actually nobody can be very certain about the outcome of a war. I think before the war, probably Putin felt he was very, he was very certain about the outcome of the war, but it's out of his expectation. So, I mean, leaders are always very. I mean, a smart leader are always very cautious about the potential or possible legacy that he or she will have on history. So I think this is, I guess, Chinese leaders or other leaders are thinking about after watching this war. So it's not about a personal thing. I mean, not about personal position or personal power, but about history, about for Chinese leader, China is a country. I mean, I know that Kaiser, your grandfather, is a very famous historian. I mean, China is a country that the people really pay very much very, heavy importance to history.
That's
So
right.
we need to think about, we need to think about the history and the position in history. I think this is something that all the Chinese leader has always considered carefully.
Let us hope that Xi Jinping is among them and thinks very, very seriously about his historical legacy. I want to stay with you for just one moment here and move from the personal to the diplomatic. I mean, it's obvious, I think it's got to be obvious to Beijing that closer Sino-Russian relations are perceived as very threatening by Ukraine, by its NATO allies. Those closer ties have clearly negatively impacted China's relations with European countries at a time when, on the one hand, China is very much trying to court them, maybe with a long-term objective of trying to realize some sort of genuine strategic autonomy on the part of Europe. But this is not good for the relationship. Are there voices in Beijing that are pushing for this, who think it is more important that we meaningfully improve ties with European countries? It's more important than continuing to throw life preserver after life preserver at Putin.
Yeah, of course. I think there are very, heated debate about all the options. One of the option is what you described, trying to, keep some distance from Russia and maybe getting closer to at least to Europe and even to the US on this issue. But the challenge, there are several challenges, I think. First, I think the mainstream view here is we believe that, China and Russia are close, but they think I myself also think this is kind of, it's a normal relation. It's not an alliance. We know that, we all know that China actually, of course, we have not provided any lethal weapons to Russia. We don't like this war. We don't support this war, and Chinese companies are very cautious, not to be sanctioned by the Western countries. So they try to comply with the sanction from the US and from Europe. But the problem, and at the same time, we also have our trade with Ukraine. We have trade with Ukraine. We are a big buyer of Ukrainian products, and actually, I think the Ukrainian troops are also using the drone they can have, made in China, fighting against Russia. But nobody say China is providing Ukrainian weapons against Russia, or China is helping Ukraine to rebuild its military industrial base. So everybody, at least in the West, criticized for that. We think this is quite unfair. And at the same time, even if, let's say, we followed this option, we adopted this option, then still mainstream view here is even if we do that, then the US and the Europe will say, this is something you should do earlier. This is something you should do. There's no incentive for this. This is the right thing you should do. You are just correcting your mistake. So how can you expect me to reward you for correcting your wrongs? Right. So again, I think particularly China-US is some kind of, this tension is some kind of structural thing. So I think we don't expect any incentives by choosing side in this war or in this tension. So we tend to maintain a kind of balance, but of course, I know that in the West, people don't think this is a balanced position, but we think we try to maintain the normal relations, including normal trade with both Russia and Ukraine, and with both Russia and the West. I think this is our position.
Thank you very much. I want to go around and I'll ask each of you one last question, and it's really kind of variations on the same question. And I'll start with you, Yi. There are a lot of people in the United States who seem to believe that anything bad for China is good for Taiwan, right? And so, I mean, that seems to be sometimes at the heart of a lot of the advocacy for decoupling, or, you know, more euphemistically, de-risking. I want to ask, from your perspective, is U.S.-China decoupling helping or hurting Taiwan's security?
Since Taiwan sits at the forefront since the heydays of Cold War, so we recognize the strategic importance or military importance of this island. It is self-explanatory, and yet we also recognize the geographical proximity between two sides of Taiwan Strait. So Taiwan need to seek for a more balanced posture. It involves two levels of interaction. I think on the strategically, since Taiwan is a small party to this triangular interactions, whereas there's a room and voices and agency, and Taiwan could play to foster a less confrontational cross-strait relations. I think in the past, we recognize that there was a moment that tacit agreement has been agreed upon, whether how fragile the consensus, the so-called political and tacit consensus across Taiwan has been contemplated. I think it's about time for both sides of Taiwan Strait to re-engage. I think it's seeking for a less confrontational. I think Taiwan should act to demonstrate that there's a room for small party to play. All right. So with that, I'm looking forward to more, a dialogue like this one. I think this is the first ever cross-strait dialogue for me since 2019. All right. So I'm really appreciated the moment that I'll be able to address to my counterpart, my old friends on China, on mainland China, to exchange ideas. So that's my best wishes.
Well, thank you. That's wonderful. Let me ask you this though: does it help in this task of re-engagement that you and I completely agree this would be a wonderful thing to see? Does it help that the United States prevents TSMC from exporting a huge percentage of its products to the Chinese mainland? Or does that actually hurt the cause of Taiwan's re-engagement with China?
I think that's a different issue. Since the United States adopted unilateral policy that is, imposed on the unilateral sanction, TSMC was reluctant to be part of it, and yet we have no liberty simply to.
Taiwan has agency, just not that much agency. Yeah.
Limited.
Yeah. That's a pity. Now, I'll turn to Dmytro and ask you the same question about this. Do you see the decline in the U.S.-China relationship manifested in things like this, decoupling, but more broadly, is this helping or hurting the security of Ukraine?
You mean dialogue between U.S. and China?
Yeah, I mean the deteriorating relationship. Is this good for Ukraine or is it bad for Ukraine?
Well, Ukraine still sees the U.S. as the most powerful, the biggest ally, and China is the main trade Ukrainian partner. So both countries are very important for Ukraine. However, on the edge of the conflict, Ukraine, well, it should conduct very safe but very safe, but also very intensive relations with both parties. But like going back to near future, when Ukraine had the possibilities to develop better diplomatic relations with China, well, I think Ukraine still had a chance, but it wasn't done. Well, The reasons there might be plenty of reasons why it didn't happen, but I think Ukraine should, well, take benefit of friendship with both parties, because the China can be really very influential party in making peace in Ukraine, and somehow, well, it's the most influential part on influencing Russia. So Ukraine should find a way to conduct dialogue with China.
Yeah, that's really what I was getting at. Thank you. And now to Emilian, just viewed from Central Eastern Europe, the same question. Is the hawkish rhetoric between Beijing and Washington actually helping in any sense either the situation in Taiwan or the situation in Ukraine, or could you see sort of more better progress made were the U.S. and China to dial down that rhetoric and to seek ways to cooperate either in, say, let's speak about the part of the world where you live, in finding ways, as Dmytro suggested, to bring Beijing more meaningfully into a possible peaceful solution to the war.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's both the United States and China in a lock-in. Like, I think we have like the wishful thinking that they could kind of overcome their differences. And I think now at the Shangri-La dialogue, the defense ministers, both of China and the United States, are going to have their first face-to-face meeting. So everybody's hoping for this happy kumbaya moment. However, unfortunately, I don't think that is likely to transpire anyone soon, especially, as you know far better than me, in the United States political scene. It's almost impossible to consider any kind of meaningful dialogue with China opening up between the United States and China. Paradoxically, however, I think from a European point of view, in a view from the European Union, to an extent East European countries, this is a quote-unquote silver lining in the sense that it assists Europe in its development of what it calls strategic autonomy, developing independence from the US security umbrella, but also kind of seeking to develop its trade and industrial base and developing innovation. Because the US has been pushing its partners, allies in Europe in particular, towards decoupling. As you know, probably Europe speaks about de-risking. We are about de-risking from China because of the very close and interconnected nature of our markets and trade relations with China, between Europe and China. Yet because of and also here what's interesting for Europe, because of the Ukraine conflict, and Eastern Europe in particular, is Europe is realizing, East Europeans are realizing that their American and Indo-Pacific partners don't consider the Russian invasion of Ukraine to be as significant a challenge as China is for those partners. They're very much left alone. In many ways, this is a distraction from the main threat, China. So this is pushing this notion of strategic autonomy more in Europe, yet it's making it very difficult for Europe to completely, quote unquote, decouple from China. But as we're seeing, there's from EVs to 5G technology to space to port infrastructure to investments, there is increasing securitization. There's increasing oversight from the European level of those investments and Chinese investments in Europe as well. So I think there is a logic that our path dependence that's already happening in Europe, simply because innovation in Europe has been suffering because of that. It's very much self-inflicted wound in European industrial lack of innovation in Europe and the lack of competition with Chinese products. But Europe in this context, I think, finds itself, and I here agree with Professor Da here, that finds itself in a situation whatever China does is too little, too late. Europe is part of now with all these measures from a Chinese point of view is creating, I guess, to use the kind of current novel, is the three-body problem for China, where China is being locked out of new technology, and China's technological innovation is suffering or potentially suffering down the road because of lack of access to both American and European technological companies, technological innovation in that setting.
It's interesting that you use this three-body metaphor, because I was at Davos a couple of years ago, and Neil Ferguson was on a panel with Adam Tooze and a couple of other people, and even without any explanation, he just sort of said, what the United States is trying to do to China right now is what the Trisolarians were trying to do to Earth. And I mean, he didn't even explain it. He sort of assumed that everyone in the audience had already read, Lilsicine. And anyway, very, very interesting. Last comment or remark goes to Professor Da. And again, it's part of the same question. Is U.S.-China decoupling, euphemistically de-risking, is the continuing sort of blame casting on China, these new tariffs that are being imposed on products that haven't even landed on American shores yet. All these things. Is this helping or hurting Taiwan's security?
I think, of course, it's hurting the U.S. policy. Hurting the Taiwan security. I think we discussed a lot about this tension of between China and the U.S. and also the tension in international politics, and the tariff thing, this high-tech restriction or decoupling thing, are just a part of this deterioration of the China-U.S. relations, and this deterioration and also this tension, I think, make our world into a oversimplified, world. This world has become, be viewed by many people in a very, very oversimplified view, like democracy versus autocracy, right? Or China, Russia versus the U.S., Europe. I mean, actually, the fact is much more complicated than this, but very unfortunately, many people, including many in China, but I will say mainly in the West, view the world in this black and white, bright and dark dichotomy. So you are on the wrong side of history. I'm on the right side of history. Then viewing the war I think the war in Ukraine accelerate this accelerate the form of this worldview, oversimplified worldview. And then because what happened in Ukraine made many Westerners, particularly the Americans, view Taiwan as next to Ukraine, which I think totally wrong, no matter from legal view or from real, everyday real politics view. I think totally wrong. But because they view Taiwan from that lens, then the U.S. decided to so-called quote unquote help Taiwan, to defend Taiwan, to arm Taiwan, which will further anger the mainland side, and then of course will put Taiwan, in more dangerous position. So it's not in Taiwan's interest, and Taiwan become, there is a potential that Taiwan has become kind of like Yuan Laoshi said, a kind of frontier, place in the world. So Taiwan used to be the most prosperous places in the world, but have a potential to become a battlefield. It's very sad that Ukraine has already become a battlefield. Do we really need more battlefields, particularly in the East Asia? I don't think we need another battlefield, particularly for Chinese, for my compatriots in Taiwan. This is, of course, not good, but that oversimplified worldview is pushing Taiwan towards that direction. It will embolden the pro-independent activities. It will also anger China, and it will hurt the people in Taiwan, of course, also hurt the people in the mainland.
Yeah, I think you've summed this up very, very nicely. We've seen a war in Ukraine over which there's very little, at least from the perspective of the West. There's no moral ambiguity in that at all. It's very clear. It is a black and white situation where there is a war of choice, a war of aggression by one state against another that it recognized as a sovereign independent state. And something is lost in translation when it's superimposed on East Asia, and that simplified analogy is applied. I think that it actually increases the risk of something very, very bad happening. Well, I want to thank you. Actually, Dmytro, you raised your hand. You have one more comment that you'd like to get in, and I'd love to hear from you. So please.
Actually, I want to agree with Professor Dawei. about the issue that, well, we already have one battlefield. We don't need a second battlefield. But, well, if you look like from very basic geopolitical theories, like both Ukraine and Taiwan lie at the edge of competition, edge of regions, like, so and these regions are usually at the middle of attention, at the middle of conflict. So it's very difficult to avoid conflicts, whatever nature these conflicts are in such a borderlands, I would say. The such kind of frontiers from, well, like civilizations, like great land and great sea powers. So it's really complicated to avoid competition among great powers, because as it is, it happens. So it's very difficult to keep the balance, especially for this kind of borderland regions.
Well, I agree, but humans have agency, and we can occasionally transcend the secular, irresistible forces of history and find pathways to peace where history might militate less pleasant outcomes. So, let me warmly thank you all, Dmytro Burtsev, Dr. Yuan, Emilian, Kavalski, and of course Dawei from Tsinghua. And a very, very warm thank you to Vita Holod here at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And thank you all for spending so much time and for sharing your rich and valuable insights. And I hope that we can all connect again in the near future.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for everyone in the audience for joining us.